We are so back. The Overwatch developers have finally revealed more details surrounding the upcoming 6 vs 6 test that they announced back in July, and a significant chunk of the fan base is rightfully pumped. Finally, we get a chance to run it back with main tank and off-tank duos, and no longer do we have to suffer under the solo tank overlord in our rank games. Have the developers finally realized the massive mistake they made transitioning to 5 vs 5 in the first place? Is 6 vs 6 going to be restored as the primary competitive mode in Overwatch? Let's dive deeper into what's next for Overwatch and how we got here in the first place. What the developers have actually announced is they'll be running 4 upcoming tests in Season 13 and Season 14, 2 of which are 6 vs 6 and the 2 others are quick play hack tests featuring our current 5 vs 5 setup with some changes to how role construction works in the first place. The first 5 vs 5 test is called Limit 2, where you have the option of flexing to other roles and you can max have 2 of each role. So in theory, you could lock in 2 tanks, 1 damage and 2 supports. But the asterisk is that this test uses open queue balance, where tanks currently have less health across the board than the current competitive queue. I'm curious to see how this turns out, but unfortunately, I don't see how this will be much more of a temporary arcade mode with great similarities to what already is the competitive open queue. The next 5 vs 5 test is a little bit more interesting, and it's called Kingmaker. In this mode, the player who is alone in their role, meaning potentially a lone damage player or a solo support player, will get a quote-unquote role buff, compensating them for the fact that they don't have a duo in their role in their team. We don't know much about this mode yet, but the devs say they want to see more freedom explored in 5 vs 5 and more types of compositions played. I can't wait to lock in Zenyatta as a solo support player and watch my team despair in critical health as I pop the hell off with my role buffs. It's time for a comeback, Jonak. Long have we awaited the return of the Giga Chad 2018 Zenyatta. In all seriousness though, I also don't think this mode is in serious contention for replacing the current 1-2-2 5 vs 5 format, aside from a fun change of pace of playing the game, which, don't get me wrong, is good in and of itself. I always welcome new way to play Overwatch, and a great example of that is the recent Junkerqueen's Laboratory Halloween mode. But if 5 vs 5 and the solo tank experience has shown us anything, it's that making a single player way stronger than everyone else in the lobby is not a fun power dynamic. As a tank player, I've loved some of the changes to make the role more fun, but it's not lost on me that a support player being chased down by a fortified Orisa or a bloodthirsty Mauga might not be the most fun thing they've had to deal with throughout Overwatch history. The developers obviously felt compelled to make tank an individually stronger role after you can no longer combine a Winston shield and a defense matrix, or a Reinhardt shield and a Zarya bubble. But the lethality of current 5 vs 5 tank and the big health pools might have gone too far. So what's to say that it's going to be much better with a solo DPS having their numbers pumped up and dealing even more damage, or potentially a stronger anti-healing debuff, or a support dealing massive healing and having more health because the rest of the team decided to play 2 tanks and 2 damage heroes. I just don't think enabling this level of extremely diverse compositional strength is that approachable from a balance perspective, considering the developers would have to balance scenarios where all 3 roles would be roughly equal in strength for all scenarios in which there might be only 1 player in a role. There's just too many different factors going on and ways to abuse the game to ensure it's unfun in the long run, which leads me to the 6 vs 6 tests. The first of the 2 6 vs 6 Jesus Christ. The first of the 2 6 vs 6 tests is called Min 1 Max 3. So no, you can't lock 3 tanks and 3 supports. Goats is officially dead again, but you can play 3 tanks if you wanted to, and maybe add a Mei into the mix, and it's like we almost never left.
So far, this combo's worked well for them before, but as soon as they see the defensive setup,
again, the developers are encouraging freedom and flexing around, trying new compositions we haven't seen before in Overwatch 2 with the introduction of the most recently added heroes. What will junkerqueen look like with a Reinhardt and 3 supports? Winston D.Va Doomfist dive is back on the menu now with Doomfist as a tank. I guess you could call this open queue, but different. At the end of the day, there was a reason that Overwatch 1 transitioned to role lock towards the later years, and I don't expect anything to have changed. This will be a fun mode to try out and experiment with, and it will help the developers get some more 6 vs 6 data points that maybe they can learn from before actually presenting us with the holy grail classic Overwatch 2-2-2. So here we are then. Good old-fashioned 2-2-2. It's finally making a comeback and opens the door for old and new Overwatch heads alike to settle the greatest debate debate once and for all in the trenches. Is 222 actually as good as people remember it to be, or will it be a fresh reminder of why Overwatch transitioned to 5 vs 5 in the first place? It's worth mentioning that during this final test, the Overwatch developers will obviously apply balance changes to tanks and reduce their power and survivability in the first place, perhaps restoring some of the skewed tank power dynamic we've come to love or hate in Overwatch 2. So will this mode be any good? I'm honestly open-minded. For the longest time, I've been a proponent of 5 vs 5, and I still very much am. But I'm looking forward to see if the developers can deal with some of the endless balance problems we've had in the original game. There are legitimately good arguments in favor of 6 vs 6, and I'm not going to ridicule the 6 vs 6 supporters by saying they're looking back at history through rose-tinted glasses, because Lord knows Blizzard have already done that mistake in the past. For a quick detour, let's go back some years and delve into the World of Warcraft franchise. From subscriber data that was publicly available, World of Warcraft was at its absolute peak in 2008 during the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, with the game going fully viral and being part of pop culture globally. It was legitimately insane. Everyone was talking about it, with celebrities sharing how they play the game too.
Like, how fanatical are you about video games?
Let's just say that I had to quit the game for a good going on year now.
Which one?
World of Warcraft.
It was like the peak of Fortnite, but only 10 years earlier. However, after the Lich King had been defeated and the developer team had revisited some of the popular stories from the original Warcraft trilogy, including the Lich King, Kel'Thuzad in Naxxramas, and Illidan, there were questions about where we were heading for the next adventure. Enter World of Warcraft Cataclysm, a new World of Warcraft expansion that saw the game transform old beloved zones into desolated shells of themselves after a huge dragon appeared in the skies and breathed fire on everything and everyone. To make a long story short, in the expansions following this pivotal moment in World of Warcraft history, game systems were always iterated on, new loot settings were made default, and gearing wasn't what it used to be, and there were new ways to re-modify gear, not to mention the reworking of classes and introduction of new classes. After just some years following the game's peak in popularity, a part of the World of Warcraft community started running private servers on old patches and expansions for a taste of how good things used to be, and it was a real thing. I was one of those guys who played on private servers via modifying server connection files and played on illegitimate servers that were later sent cease and desist letters from Blizzard because the early expansions and game experience was that good. Ultimately, these private server communities grew in size to the point where it was no longer reasonable for the WoW team to turn the other way and ignore it. The fans pleaded for a verified Blizzard-owned classic server so that fans could relive the game they used to love, and after being told no...
And by the way, you don't want to do that either. You think you do, but you don't.
It became a massive hit following the debut of Classic WoW in 2019. It had worked, and the fans were right. So, coming back to Overwatch, with all this in mind, I don't feel like it's right for me to tell the 222 crowd that they're wrong or that their idea of fun isn't legitimate. If someone voices the opinion that they genuinely loved the game more back then, that's completely understandable. And speaking of liking things, have you liked this video and subscribed to my YouTube channel? Because that is one way to generate some good karma for yourself. So let's talk about some of the good of 222. The first one is, of course, that equal power distribution is a thing. Now, it's never going to be perfectly divided between all 6 players in the server, considering hero balance and the impact of different roles, but a 222 game format is an easier starting point for getting things right, rather than isolating a tank player and trying to make them capable of holding down the frontline themselves, while also making it an enjoyable first-person shooter game experience. By introducing a second tank into the lineup, heroes like Winston are going to have to be toned down and become more manageable for support players to deal with. Orisa no longer requires insane survivability to do her job, because hopefully there will be a second tank to back them up. And a hero like Zarya is finally able to have some of her inherent weaknesses shored up by other tanks on the team. Additionally, if the developers truly take a cutthroat approach to the hero reworks they mentioned in the developer blog and make sure to reduce some of the viability of stacking sustain or mitigation so we don't have to revisit double shield scenarios, 222 could be a fantastic way of permitting tanks to be lethal without risking the lack of counterplay for enemy players. Finally, with 222 comes the reintroduction of main tank and off-tank duos, where tank players get the opportunity to play alongside a teammate with a similar mindset and the chance to help each other out in taking space while simultaneously simultaneously protecting the rest of the team. A lot of friendships over the course of Overwatch 1 were made in the tank role, and it was a bond that was unlike anything tank players have had in Overwatch 2. When I think back to my own playing career, I of course had great damage teammates, but it was the off-tank players I remember most and look back on the most fondly. It's going to be a blast to relive that experience with the return of 2-2 in the upcoming Season 14 test. Unfortunately, with all that time spent glazing 2-2 and Overwatch 1, we have to review the arguments against and what led the developers towards 5 vs 5 in the first place. There are many ways to kick off this segment, and I honestly think we have to go all the way back to the start of Overwatch 1 and ask ourselves why they chose 6 vs 6 in the first place. Here's a GameSpot interview with Jeff Kaplan where he explains what led to their original vision for Overwatch.
And what had happened over the years since Team Fortress 2's release is we had this big boom of MOBA games. And I think the thing that really spoke to people in MOBAs more than anything was how coordinated teams could really be successful. And the Team Fortress competitive community knew that this existed, but that community was really small. Like the Team Fortress community was huge in terms of who was playing it, but a lot of us were playing it in pubs where we'd get on these servers that would be modified, you know, like I'm playing 12v12 instant respawn, and it was just kind of this chaos meat grinder where I think the TF2 competitive people realized, like, no, if you really coordinate and play this in a tight competitive way, it's all about the team play that you saw exploding in MOBAs. And those games were built from the get-go to embrace, you know, in their case, 5v5 gameplay. So I think we saw a refinement that could take place that said, well, what if you had these cool abilities, epic, you know, abilities happening, great movement, and then really embrace the team play and objective-based gameplay, but really focus people on winning or losing as a group. So I think all those elements combined are what led to Overwatch becoming Overwatch.
After watching this clip, undoubtedly, teamwork was a main focus for the development team. And with that, the opportunity in a 2-2 setting to overcome the enemy team, even if you had one player on your team underperform, which is harder to do in 5 vs 5. The big question is, how much fun is teamwork compared to the opportunity for an individual to take over and carry the game? Obviously, it's a subjective question, but in 5 vs 5, you've had more impact than ever before to make your presence felt in the lobby. And to many, that is a more rewarding experience than finding yourself frustrated as to why you're not progressing as a team, and why in some matches puzzle pieces are naturally falling into place and you're steamrolling, while in others your team is running around like headless chickens. While the main tank and off-tank partnership was beloved, countless matches were already decided before spawn doors had opened, because you happened to be a serious off-tank player who had been slotted together with a roadhog one-trick, or two main tank Reinhardt Winston players who couldn't effectively contribute on Zarya or Sigma. In Overwatch 2, you still run the risk of being matched with a teammate who is one-tricking or not optimizing the hero choice, but at least it's not as egregious of an experience as in 2-2. I guess now is also the time to bring up the inescapable problem of queue times. It's a hard fact and sad reality for any future hope of 2-2. There just aren't enough tank players in the game. There just aren't enough tank players in any game. It's a role whose popularity doesn't hold a candle to that of damage or carry roles in other competitive games, and the end result in a format like 2-2 that requires the same amount of tanks as damage players is that you're going to have to wait a very long time for a match if you're a damage or support player. In the initial 6 vs 6 blog released by the development team in July, the Overwatch developers shared some insight into just how bad the problem really was in Overwatch 1. In a 2-2 post-role lock world, the average queue time for a damage player was 7.6 minutes, whereas in Overwatch 2 and 5 vs 5, it decreased to 2.9 minutes. That's an unbelievable difference. No matter how good balancing is, no matter how good the tank heroes are, damage is always going to be the most queued role, and having to wait an extremely long time to load into a game is non-negotiable. Maybe there's a slight bit of hope here in case the developers divided main tanks and off-tank role selections and encourage damage players to also consider adding more damage-oriented tank heroes to their hero pool like Zarya or junkerqueen. But even then, you're helplessly grasping for straws in trying to make 2-2 a viable format in the first first place. I think it's fair to say that the introduction of 5 vs 5 and 1-2-2 has reduced the amount of variance in compositional experimentation and silliness that goes into a game of Overwatch. Long gone are the days of triple damage compositions, 5 Winstons on Hanamura, or Reinhardt Winston compositions. But I think it's also fair to say that the reduction in compositional variance has made Overwatch 2 a more playable game in the first place. When I'm queuing Overwatch in 2024, I have a greater expectation that the match I'm queuing into is going to be a reasonably fair and present me with an enjoyable experience, rather than one I look back on as simply a waste of time and a waste of skill rating. If you truly embraced and loved the highs of 6 vs 6, and whether it was roll queue or triple tank, triple support, you also have to recognize that there were some really low lows, mangled with impossible compositional errors, lack of teamwork, or nothing short of double shield meta abuse. Talking about the Overwatch 1 compositions, let's take a look at some of them. While GOATs, triple tank, triple support, is the classic example of a meta that truly broke the game and lasted for way too long, there were endless examples of top-end metas that weren't fun to play. Another example is obviously double shield, which also lasted for too long because they were working on Overwatch 2, where old Orisa would pair up with Sigma and create what felt like an impenetrable barrier. We also had metas like Zombie Goats, where teams would lock in Winston Diva, Reaper Echo, Lucio Moira, and just run it down mid, hoping for a pick or a good ultimate to come online so that someone would die, because spoiler, no one died. Hence the name Zombie Goats. Now, there were some good metas too. The greatest approval ratings usually involved metas with Winstons, a Brigana backline, or a Brig Zenyatta backline, or some variation of Reinhardt Brawl in a 2-2 setting. But I think most important, reflecting on 6 vs 6, the meta was usually the meta, meaning we saw less variety, we saw less experimentation from pro teams, and usually there was an optimal composition to be played at all times. This would of course change slightly depending on what maps were being played, and if you were defense or offense, but for the most part, metas in Overwatch 1 were a little bit more stiff. And this has honestly been one of my favorite arguments for why I prefer 5 vs 5. There's just more variety and more compositions being played. Throughout Overwatch 2's life cycle, there has of course been overtuned characters, whether it's Kiriko, Mauga, Sojourn, or current day Juno, that have led to a fairly one-sided meta, but for the most part, we've seen much greater willingness from pro players and the general player base to change up their compositions and flex between poke compositions, dive, brawl. Back when I queued into ranked in Overwatch 1, I always knew what hero I was going to play before I even loaded into the game, whereas in Overwatch 2, there are a lot more heroes that would be the most optimal choice depending on what map I'm loading into or what composition the rest of my team is playing. Previously a main tank player, I might have to pick Sigma if I load into Circuit Real or Havana, Winston on Gibraltar, junkerqueen on New Junk City, Reinhardt on Throne of Anubis, and I haven't even mentioned Orisa Diva if they're called for, or Zarya to counter those two picks in particular. That's a stark difference from what was offered to me in Overwatch 1, when a meta was usually the go-to pick on most maps in the map pool. Now, a primary argument from players of 6 vs 6 is that we should still see that level of choice in a current day 2-2 because the balance team has been so impressive these last couple of years. The Overwatch hero design team have done a fantastic job of introducing us to fun new heroes like Juno and junkerqueen, and took a pretty bad hero in lifeweaver and made them playable after many adjustments and quality of life upgrades. That's a very good sign for Overwatch's future and any hopes for the success of 2-2. But there were also been some of the misses that we can't forget about. For example, Mauga meta was by far the worst meta we've had since the release of Overwatch 2, and while it didn't last a year, it was a meta that off-put a lot of players, including me. And the same can be said for Juno, who might only have been out for a little longer than 2 months, but is still dominating support hero pick rates, win rates, and possesses a kit that makes a lot of other heroes look ancient in comparison. These kind of overpowering metas will still present themselves in 2-2, no matter how good we think the balance team is. Additionally, the introduction of a second tank hero in Classic 2-2 introduces primarily more health, more mitigation, two attributes that usually are synonymous with a reduction in fun for all players on the server. Yes, you might currently have to deal with a stronger solo tank, but you're not going to have a much better time dealing with both Winston Bubble and Defense Matrix, or Reinhardt and Sigma Shield at the same time. I think it's fair to assume that you can draw some pretty strong parallels between what the community considers to be quote-unquote good metas, with metas that involve less mitigation, less overpowering sustain, and are less ultimate dependent. The current Juno Brig meta is a prime example of a meta where the great defensive abilities of Brigitte make up for Juno's supposed weakness, and their two ultimates makes the two of them fairly unpunishable in the fight where those ultimates are available, resulting in you as an opponent forced to disengage, just simply trying to stay alive until you have a chance to re-engage. In closing, I'm looking forward to the Classic 2-2 test, because it's going to generate a lot of hype and excitement for players who love Overwatch, whether they moved on to new games or find the current format undesirable. And the best time to be an Overwatch fan is when everyone's enjoying the game and getting what they want. I will say, while I'm pessimistic about the chances of 2-2 returning to become the primary competitive mode in favor of 5 vs 5, I could definitely see how classic 2-2 becomes a permanent arcade mode, or alternate rank queue for those who prefer to play the game that way. To me, the end goal is always satisfying as many Overwatch fans as possible and allowing players to play the game their preferred way. 5 vs 5 might not be for everybody, but for now I've come to terms with it and I've embraced what it does for the game. I'm having more fun playing Overwatch than I've had in a really long time, and I look forward to see what the Overwatch developers will do to make it even more fun for everybody. Thank you for watching today's video on 2-2 and 6 vs 6. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're enjoying these videos in general. I enjoy doing them, and shout out to my great video editor Vengeance, who is helping me out with these videos. Let me know what topic you want me to discuss next. Drop a comment down below. Please like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel to be reminded when I'll be dropping the next video. Until then, you can check me out on my Twitch, twitch.tv/reinforce. Drop a Prime sub if you have it, and thank you for the support, everybody. Until next time, enjoy Overwatch, and I'll see you in the next video.